So welcome everybody, hello, good morning. Thank you for being here this Friday. Both the folks here in the room as well as the folks on the Zoom webinar, hello, wherever you are. We are here at the Communication Arts and Sciences building at Michigan State University. I'd like to welcome you to the very first talk of the Rural Computing Speaker Series. Thanks to the generous sponsorship from the Quello Center, we were able to bring Chris here today to host this as a hybrid event. So before I introduce Chris, I'd like to first tell you about the Rural Computing Research Consortium, the organization hosting this event. The Rural Computing Research Consortium started this year, and in fact, this is our very first event, so it's very exciting for me. The consortium is a group of faculty and students who are interested in advancing research and outreach related to rural computing, sort of broadly, to computing broadly construed in rural areas. We currently have 16 affiliates who represent 5 colleges across Michigan State University. And we take a big tent approach to rural computing from many different disciplinary perspectives, and our topics range from precision agriculture to economic development to information and media policy. The consortium seeks to unite faculty, our affiliates, across at MSU in pursuit of 4 separate goals. First, to increase the visibility of cutting-edge research in rural computing. Second, to build on MSU's strengths as a land-grant institution and promote research impact and opportunity in rural communities in Michigan and around the world. Third, to promote and facilitate collaboration across campus units. And fourth, to secure MSU's place in the United States as one of the premier places to do rural computing research. So to meet these goals, we're first hosting a series of events this academic year, including the speaker series. The next one of which will be in October, featuring Phoebe Sengers from Cornell University. If you're interested in learning more about the speaker series or the consortium, you can find us at ruralcomputing.msu.edu. But most of you aren't here to hear about the consortium. You're actually here because of the person sitting right here in front of me. So Christopher Ali is an associate professor in the Department of Media Studies at the University of Virginia. His research focuses on telecommunications policy, broadband deployment, localism, local news, and critical political economy. Among Dr. Ali's most recent accomplishments include an outstanding op-ed in the New York Times on the need for an American National Rural Broadband Plan, testifying before the United States Senate Commerce Committee regarding rural broadband policy, and of course, his brand new book coming out this month from MIT Press, Fresh Broadband, The Politics of Rural Connectivity, which is what we'll be hearing about today. We will have a Q&A after Chris's talk, so if you are in the Zoom webinar, please use the Q&A feature. And with that, I will go ahead and hand it over to Chris.
All right. Well, thank you so much.
Of course.
Appreciate it.
Thank you for being here.
Thank you to the Rural Computing Research Consortium and also the Quello Center. I've never been to Michigan State before, so this is really exciting to meet all of you, and I hope it's the start of many conversations to come. My talk today, which is called When Good Enough is the Enemy of Great Rural Broadband in the United States, is about the policies and lived realities of rural broadband here in the US. I want to compare and contrast these policies and politics involved in getting broadband to rural communities with the resiliency and tenacity of these local rural communities. And this, of course, is all, found and taken from my forthcoming book, Fresh Broadband, The Politics of Rural Connectivity, which will be out, shameless plug here, on September 21st. If you're interested in buying it, I have a discount code. It's MIT10, and you can get it on the Penguin Random House website. Just use that, and it'll be a 10% discount. So, for over a decade, broadband deployment, which forms part of what we call the digital divide, has been a major area of focus for policymakers and lawmakers at both the state and federal levels. Certainly, though, their attention has ebbed and flowed. It found purchase in 2009 with a $7 billion rural broadband package found in the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, and again in 2014 when the FCC first began subsidizing broadband. This attention was henceforth ratcheted up during and by the global COVID-19 pandemic, which painfully and dramatically demonstrated the depth of the rural-urban digital divide among the many other digital divides plaguing the United States. These, of course, include broadband deserts among tribal communities and minority communities, K through 12 and post-secondary, broadband availability, affordability, and adoption, skill training and development. My work, though, focuses on the rural-urban digital divide of infrastructure in particular. This means getting wires into the ground and hung up on poles and erecting towers. It's the materiality of broadband, if you will. And this certainly does not negate the crucial importance of the other pillars of the digital divide here in this country. Oh, goodness. There we go. The COVID-19 pandemic underscored the necessities of broadband and the lack of broadband for so many. Quickly, the public and lawmakers alike were told that what many of us already knew. The digital divide is much bigger than we thought. Upwards of 42 million Americans, we were told, lack access to broadband infrastructure. Even more lack access because of affordability. And even more than that, upwards of 162 million Americans, or 50% of the population, lack access to the internet at broadband-defined speeds. Appropriately, Congress sprung into action with multiple hearings on the topic. There we go. Multiple hearings on the topic and the promise of big spending. The Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2021 and the CARES Act pledged $3.2 billion for an emergency broadband benefit program, which would subsidize broadband subscriptions for low-income households, upwards of $50 a month and $75 a month in tribal communities. This was crucial because Americans pay some of the highest prices for broadband in OECD countries, upwards of $84 a month. Additionally, $100 million was awarded to USDA's Broadband Reconnect program, $1 billion for tribal broadband, $300 million for rural broadband, and $285 million for broadband connectivity HBCUs. Following this, the American Rescue Plan, ARPA, so even more funding allocated towards broadband, including $219.8 billion for states to be used, and $10 billion for state infrastructure projects, which specifically mentioned broadband. Last but certainly not least, ARPA allocated $7 billion for connectivity at anchor institutions, specifically schools and libraries. As many of us may already know, the Biden infrastructure bill, which was hence passed in the Senate, promises an additional $65 billion for broadband funding, including $42 billion for broadband infrastructure deployment and $14 billion to shore up the emergency broadband benefit program. So in total, $76 billion have been allocated specifically to broadband from Congress in the last 18 months, with an additional $239 billion that could or may go to broadband projects. This is a colossal amount of money. The question is, though, will it be enough to end the digital divide? Unfortunately, if history has its way, it may not be. What I mean by that is that broadband policy, specifically the policies and laws promoting broadband deployment in rural America, are defined what I call the politics of good enough. By this, I mean that policies and regulations that govern the subsidization of broadband in rural areas have largely privileged the largest telecommunications and cable providers by encouraging the deployment of outdated technology, funding without accountability, and weak deployment targets. Broadband policy towards rural America is thus defined by getting a communications product that is merely good enough. Those against anything more say that we risk providing a gold-plated service or a Lexus to rural America when what is really needed is a camera. When it comes to broadband, however, good has become the enemy of great. Everyone needs access to this modern infrastructure, exactly how everyone in the 1930s needed affordable access to electricity. When the Roosevelt administration decided to electrify the countryside through the creation of the Rural Electrification Administration, it did not limit the number of light bulbs a house could have or outlets a room could have. Instead, it loudly proclaimed in 1932 that electricity is no longer a luxury. It is a definite necessity. Interestingly, in March 2021, President Biden echoed this sentiment, stating that broadband internet is the next electricity. Truth be told, the federal government spent roughly $47 billion on broadband deployment from 2009 to 2017. Through programs governed by the FCC, the USDA, and NTIA, rural broadband deployment receives at least $6 billion a year, and yet the digital divide persists. So where is this money going? In my book, I address this question through the theoretical toolkit provided by Critical Political Economy of Communication in the tradition of Vincent Mosco, Leslie Shade, Robert McChesney, and Victor Picard. I also address this question through a triangulated method of critical discourse analysis and thematic coding analysis of policy documents and public comments to regulatory dockets. I've conducted in-depth interviews with key stakeholders and site visits and participant observation with rural broadband providers, rural communities, industry events, and regulatory proceedings. The hallmark of my trip, or my research, has most certainly been what I call the rural broadband road trip, where my hound dog Tuna and I drove 4,000 miles across the American Midwest, meeting with, talking to, and learning from rural residents, broadband providers, local officials, and state representatives. I call this a process of lived policy, borrowing from lived theology and contextual theology, a method to understand how public policy decisions are lived on the ground. I argue in Farm Fresh Broadband that rural policy is both incomplete and broken. It is incomplete and broken because it lacks coordinated federal leadership and is mired in a battle between regulators, a bewildering array of rules, inconsistent state intervention, the dominance of large providers, and a policy process that favors these companies over the hundreds of local and cooperative ISPs. So to be sure, the $6 billion allocated for rural broadband is being spent on rural broadband, but it's not being spent democratically or efficiently. And it is of these failed policies to which I will draw our attention in the first part of this talk. I will discuss policies regarding speeds, mapping, funding. The second part will be to profile and celebrate local communities who, despite a policy infrastructure predicated not on rural community development, but on quarterly profits and returns, have connected themselves. And in the third part of the talk, I'll conclude with some recommendations for the future and the promises and pitfalls of the Biden administration's $65 billion broadband package. First and foremost, we need to come to a mutual understanding of what precisely broadband is. According to the Federal Communications Commission, broadband is an always-on internet connection of 25 megabits per second download, 3 megabits per second upload. Said differently, the FCC uses a metric of speed by which to assess who has access to broadband and who does not. Others use a more experience-driven definition of broadband. So according to the Congressional Research Service, broadband is provided by a series of technologies that gives users the ability to send and receive data at volumes and speeds necessary to support a number of applications, including voice communications, entertainment, telemedicine, distance education, telework, e-commerce, civic engagement, public safety, and energy conservation. But I want you to keep in mind this definition up here for speed, because that's something that we're going to talk about in a couple of slides. I've realized I'm breathing really shallowly, so I'm just going to take a really deep breath. Lots of talking with a mask on. I appreciate your indulgence, sir. All right, so according to the FCC, 95.6% of the American population has access to broadband. This includes 98.8% of the urban population, 82.7% of the rural population, and 79.1% of the tribal population. In a few slides, I'm going to explain why these numbers are totally wrong. But for the time being, let's stick with them. 17% of rural Americans, or 11.26 million people, lack access to broadband networks. This includes 18% of rural school children. When it's available, only 72% of rural Americans actually subscribe to broadband. One reason for the discrepancy between availability and adoption is because of competition and cost. Rural Americans pay more for broadband and have fewer options. Only 19% of rural Americans have a choice in their broadband provider. And this lack of competition drives up prices to unfathomable amounts in urban centers. The lowest density populated areas pay upwards of 37% more on average for broadband than the densest centers. I know for me in Charlottesville, Virginia, I think we pay about $150 a month for our broadband. So in sum, even when it's available, rural Americans pay more for worse connections and fewer options than their urban counterparts. There we go. So why do we need broadband anyways? We've all heard this question, and my snarky answer to this is usually that it was the same question asked about electricity in the 1930s. Today, the internet and broadband access are not luxuries, they are necessities and public utilities. In my work, I developed what I call the 5 pillars of rural broadband to talk about the importance of broadband to rural communities. And these include economic development, education, health, civic engagement, and quality of life. And since my book was written, I have since added a 6th category, public safety. And this is not a technologically determinist argument. The mere existence or presence of fiber optics in the ground or fixed wireless in the air in a rural community does not solve rural inequality ipso facto. This is not a build it and business and prosperity will come argument. But the lack of connectivity certainly does not help. So the reasons for the digital divides are myriad, right? Income, age, interest, location, race, prevalence. A political economic lens, however, sees the digital divide existing because of a failure of private markets to provide this essential service and a failure of policy to create the necessary market conditions, or better yet, categorize broadband as a utility. Economists would call this a market failure. That is the condition that exists when the private market is unable or unwilling to provide for a basic social or public good because of a lack of return on investment. Rural broadband, by definition, is a market failure. And in turn, the lack of broadband in rural America has reproduced democratic, social, and economic inequality. There's simply not enough people living in rural America to merit private market investment, or so the argument goes. But this is why we have public policy. Piling on top of this, the lack of broadband also becomes part of what is known as the rural penalty. The rural penalty describes the material and figurative costs paid by rural residents and businesses for their geographic distance from the centers of commerce and culture. These factors include, quote, small markets, high transportation costs, and physical isolation, brought on by the so-called tyranny of distance. Access to advanced telecommunications, first in the form of the telephone and now in terms of broadband, has been thought of the distance-killing technologies necessary to correct for the rural penalty. Distance-killing technologies is a turn of phrase by Malachi Morrison in 2003. Unfortunately, though, this time-space dichotomy still holds on to life in rural America, despite efforts at erasure by both capitalism and telecommunications. That the rural-urban digital divide persists in the broadband age suggests, therefore, that the digital divide is not a technological or natural problem, but rather a problem of political economy and policy. And policy has certainly failed in this regard. And I want to tell you about 3 instances in which federal policy has failed to correct the digital divide. And we're going to start with speed, or the meaning of broadband. So remember that the FCC currently defines broadband as an always-on connection of 25 megabits per second download, 3 megabits per second, right? Well, this definition, if we were to compare it to, for instance, Canada's benchmark of 50 megabits per second, 10 megabits per second, is woefully inadequate. The average download speed, according to Ookla in the United States, is now 192 megabits per second and 68 megabits per second upload. If download is about consumption, like streaming, gaming, chatting, upload is about production, from Zoom and FaceTime to real-time soil analysis. If upload becomes annoying for Zoom, it is devastating for telecommuting as many of us have learned during the last 18 months. So one of the major problems with this 25-degree definition is that it's both outdated and it is asymmetric. As part of this definition, the FCC has adopted a policy of what is called technological neutrality. Technological neutrality means that policy and policymakers should not favor one broadband technology over another. More specifically, though, that companies deploying a particular technology, be it DSL or fiber, fixed wireless, or satellite, have an equal chance to compete for funding. At the moment, technological neutrality is the reigning policy position of both the USDA and the FCC. There are many ways that Americans can access the internet. DSL, fixed wireless, cable, satellite, and cellular among them. And of course, 2.1 million Americans and some 60,000 farms still use dial-up. But not all internet connections are created equal. And instead of being technologically neutral, we have become technologically blind. The problem with technological neutrality as a policy principle is that it equalizes these technologies, suggesting that it doesn't matter how you connect to the internet, only that you do. So for instance, it ignores the fact that the median download and upload speed of DSL, or digital subscriber line, the most common broadband technology in rural America, is only 10 megabits per second download, 1 megabit per second upload. Or that fixed wireless systems are subject to weather conditions and line of sight. Or that coaxial cable dramatically favors download over upload. Or that satellite internet is prohibitively expensive, contains numerous low data caps, and is vexingly slow. LEO satellite, or low Earth orbital satellite, such as Starlink, has proven better than their geosynchronous counterparts. But Starlink is still in beta testing, and it seems that Elon Musk has pivoted from broadband for all to broadband for remote regions. Susan Crawford, in her fabulous book, Fiber, says that, well, fiber is the only way we should be going. Money spent on wires other than fiber is wasted, she writes. Fiber is fast, fiber is symmetric, fiber is future-proof. The problem? Fiber is expensive, upwards of $27,000 per mile, and when just aerially thrown. This means that rural communities are between a rock and a hard place. Do they use an outdated technology that is cheaper, or do they invest in fiber? However, policy prefers the former to the latter. Telecommunications companies have been incredibly successful in lobbying for technological neutrality because it keeps their technologies, notably DSL and satellite, in the mix for funding. In fact, current funding programs dramatically favor telephone companies over all other providers. So when we look at the problem of speed, we find two issues working hand in hand: the definition itself and the issue of technological neutrality. Let's talk about money. Oh, mapping, excuse me. Recall, so I said earlier that 17% of rural Americans lack broadband. Well, we're not actually sure of that number. We're not sure because we don't know how many people have broadband and where these people live. This is the problem with mapping. There are numerous flaws in the FCC's broadband data gathering method that have led to confusion, frustration, and accusation. Recent studies by Penn State, for instance, found that the FCC's data is off by at least 50%, while a shocking release from Microsoft found that upwards of 50% of all Americans lack access to broadband speeds. Part of this confusion comes from what is actually being captured here. Currently, the FCC uses something called Form 477, which is filled out and submitted biannually by internet service providers. Broadband deployment is not reported at the individual location here, but rather by something known as the census block. What a census block is in a major metropolitan area can often be one or two streets or perhaps a neighborhood. In an area such as Alaska, however, a census block can be 8,500 square miles. So it's filled out at the census block level. What is worse, however, is that a broadband provider simply has to claim that one building within a census block is served or has the potential to be served in 10 days. If that is the case, then the entire census block is considered served with broadband. Making matters worse, ISPs only have to report advertised speeds rather than actual speeds, leading to distortion as to who is really connected and underconnected. Thanks to the policies of technological neutrality, moreover, the FCC also considers satellite internet as a broadband technology, where I don't know if anyone here has ever experienced satellite internet knows that this is further from the truth. Incidentally, we also learned in 2019 that 4G deployment in the country was exaggerated by mobile phone providers by 40%. So we were definitely not as connected as we thought we were. This has led, as I previously argued, to a gross exaggeration of broadband connectivity in the country, specifically in the sparsely populated areas of rural America. In addition to being overcounted, there is also the issue of funding eligibility. Once a community or census block is considered served, it is made ineligible for funding considerations from either the FCC or the USDA. So these communities are either unconnected or stuck using antiquated technology. And I want to give you an example from research I recently conducted in Virginia. This is part of a survey I've done of 95 counties, the 95 counties regarding broadband policies and planning. As part of the survey, I asked county administrators to report to the best of their knowledge broadband deployment at 25-3, and specifically asked them to not give me FCC data. In one county, Orange County, we saw a 94.77% discrepancy between the FCC and the county. The FCC says that Orange County is 100% served at 25-3 with 3 providers or more. Orange County tells us they are 5% served at 25-3. And I should add that we have not independently verified these numbers, but even just the reporting suggests that something is dramatically wrong. Moreover, Orange County, Virginia would be ineligible for future grants. So that future $65 billion, it would be ineligible for. To be fair, there has been movement on this front. The passage of the Broadband Data Act in 2020 orders the FCC to revise its mapping methodology. States, with Georgia being a leader, have also gotten heavily involved in creating their own much more granular maps. But with the promise of tens of billions of dollars on the table, the importance of accurate mapping cannot be overstated. All right, now we're going to talk about money, or funding rather. Remember in pre-pandemic times, those olden days, that the federal government spends about $6 billion annually subsidizing rural broadband deployment. This money originates from 2 sources: the Federal Communications Commission, which operates the Universal Service Fund, and the United States Department of Agriculture. The FCC provides roughly $5 billion a year, while USDA provides roughly $1.4 billion in loans and grants. The problem here is not the amount of money, but how it's being spent. First and foremost, the history of the FCC's broadband support programs, which only began in 2014, the majority of the funding went to telecommunications companies and completely ignored alternative entrants like municipalities and electric cooperatives. Take, for example, the FCC's Connect America Fund, which ran from 2015 to 2021. During this time, roughly $1 billion a year was given to the 10 largest telecommunications companies like AT&T, CenturyLink, Frontier, and Windstream. In return, they had minimal build-out standards. They only had to provide, for instance, 10.1 instead of the national definition of 25.3, and didn't have to upgrade their networks. So in short, they were still connecting us with the old copper and DSL wires in exchange for billions of dollars. Moreover, both CenturyLink and Frontier also failed to meet their build-out requirements in 2018 and 2019, but faced no discernible consequence. In fact, both were allowed to continue to bid for money in the recent Rural Digital Opportunity Fund. There's a second pot of money called the alternative Connect America model, and that is to spend another $1 billion, this time spread among 200 smaller telecommunications companies, usually cooperatives. These smaller companies have a higher build-out requirement at 25.3, and most are laying fiber rather than copper. Then lastly, there is a smaller pot of money 148 million given to 103 auction winners. These auction winners are oftentimes those telephone and electric cooperatives. Recently, the FCC began awarding money from its $20.4 billion Rural Digital Opportunity Fund. This is a tremendous amount of money. But again, we saw history repeating itself, with the loudest and largest providers like Charter and Starlink, and even CenturyLink and Frontier, who had previously defaulted on commitment, garnering hundreds of millions of dollars annually. Worse, the FCC has appeared to have not done its due diligence in awarding its final round of grants last year, which totaled $9.2 billion. In one instance, LTD Communications, which is a fixed wireless provider, won $311 million in annual support by promising to provide gigabit speeds. The problem? There is no way a fixed wireless network could possibly deliver gigabit speeds. It is technologically impossible. So presently, some winners such as LTD and Starlink have begun being asked by the FCC to surrender some of the funding promised because of unverifiable or over-exaggerated claims. In sum, what we have here is a policy ethos of good enough. Slow speeds are good enough. Bad maps are good enough. Bad actors are good enough for the rural and remote communities of our country. So what I've been arguing in my work and in my book is that we need to democratize the funding process and stop favoring the largest telecommunications providers, or as I call it, the loudest and the largest. So in contrast to the loudest and the largest, hundreds of smaller, more nimble, and importantly, more local providers have been doing the job of connecting rural America with what Jonathan Salet calls high-performance broadband. This has included telephone and electric cooperatives, along with municipal and regional public networks. And I'd like to tell you about one of these networks found in Rock County, Minnesota. Rock County is located in the southwest pocket of the state, bordering South Dakota to the west and Iowa to the south. For years, its incredible county administrator had been looking for what he told me was a dance partner to deploy and operate a fiber optic network. After being rebuffed by the major providers, he turned to Alliance Communications, a telecommunications cooperative in South Dakota. With the help of the Minnesota Broadband Office, which itself is a leader in state broadband planning, it won a $5 million grant. Alliance put in another $6 million, and to finance the last required million, the county bonded itself against 10 years of its wind turbine tax. Over the course of a single calendar year, which of course meant a Minnesota winter, Rock County, thanks to its digital champions and commitment to what I call, borrowing from Oliver Sylvain's term broadband localism, Rock County became the most connected county in Minnesota, with a fiber pass-through rate of 99.93%. The county of 10,000 people, which is incredible. So there are some incredible success stories. So what can be done? Well, I argue that local broadband is the best broadband. And because of that, we need to reframe and redirect our policies and programs to encourage and fund local providers. What else can be done? In the conclusion of my book, I argue that we need a national rural broadband plan. We actually had such a plan in 2009, which was something ordered by the 2008 Farm Bill. The plan was written by then FCC acting chair Michael Cobbs, who is a personal hero of mine, and was written after extensive public consultation. Unfortunately, it was eclipsed and made redundant the following year by the National Broadband Plan, which laid out America's digital future, but shifted the conversation away from rural and towards national ambition. We need to reclaim this plan and reinvent it for the 2020s. For precedent, I look to the 1930s and the Rural Electrification Administration, a New Deal agency tasked with wiring rural America with electricity through loans and grants to provide providers and outreach to consumers. Founded in 1935, it took REA 15 years to connect over 90% of rural and agricultural America to the electric grid. So strong is this parallel between electricity and broadband that one of my respondents, which the president would later echo, simply stated, broadband is the next electricity. So I argue that we need to reclaim the energy and purpose of the Rural Electrification Administration. Now, because of the nature of academic publishing, Congress beat me to the punch for a couple of the following recommendations here. I know, right? Yeah. I don't know what that says about book publishing, but the impulse and importance remains. So first, I argue that Congress needs to appoint a lead agency to cut through regulatory clutter. I have long suggested that this agency be USDA rather than the FCC, as it removes partisan politics from the issue and harnesses USDA's presence across the country. To be sure, the USDA, FCC, and NTIA all have important roles to play. For instance, the FCC still controls the majority of funding. But we need an agency to lead the charge, to require data and knowledge sharing, and to author America's rural broadband plan. I should add here that the infrastructure package actually gives all of those duties to the NTIA, so it's good. Next would be for this organization to deploy a number of policy elements. This would include setting a realistic but ambitious definition of broadband, one that maintained the ethos of technological neutrality, but would set forward-looking speed thresholds. When I testified before the Senate, I argued that that minimum should be 100 symmetric. This way, technologies are not excluded on spec, but must be able to deliver these speeds on day one. Obviously, we also need to revise the broadband mapping methodology and stop relying on industry self-reports. We need to create a challenge process so that rural communities have an avenue to protest if they are overcounted. We need to eliminate state barriers to cooperative and municipal broadband that have, by and large, been passed at the behest of the code. So right now, 18 states either prohibit or inhibit municipalities from forming their own broadband networks. We need to democratize the funding process and stop privileging the largest telecommunications providers. Again, this includes allowing cooperatives, municipalities, and new entrants to bid on funding. We also need to streamline the policy process. So throughout my research, one thing that I heard repeatedly from small providers was the difficulty of even applying for loans and grants. We need to make it easier on them. A rural broadband policy would also include funding for digital inclusion, specifically computer access and skill development. Broadband that just sits there unused after all is absolutely worthless. And last but not least, it would give serious reconsideration to 5G deployment. Presently, the FCC is basing its 5G strategy on what's called high band or millimeter wave spectrum. Well, this bandwidth delivers ultra-fast connectivity and low latency. The signal reach is only 800 feet before requiring a boost. As such, we've heard a lot in recent years of small cell deployment. Because of its geographic limitations then, millimeter wave 5G is absolutely unfeasible for rural America. So the FCC needs to consider its plans. As for the Biden administration, I'm cautiously optimistic. Certainly $42 billion is nothing to sneeze at, though it falls short of the original $80 billion that was promised and what the FCC says is needed. The bigger challenge, as I see it, however, is that making sure history does not repeat itself. Currently, broadband, even in the infrastructure plan, remains defined at 25.3, although underserved is now 120. So money, as I said, will be distributed by the NTIA and not the FCC. So maybe they will do a better job. But we see a lack of protections for municipalities and cooperatives. And already some are concerned that this $42 billion for deployment will only go towards forward. So we're going to have this. I want to conclude this talk by asking a bit of your indulgence. Because I'm going to read the last page of my book to you, so like spoiler alert, right? But I think it sums up the issue quite nicely. And this is actually going to be the first time I've ever read something from my book out loud. So this is like pretty exciting. All right, here it is. Deep breath. I'm continually struck by something Bernadine Jocelyn, the Director of Public Policy and Engagement at Minnesota's Blandin Foundation, told me in her interview for my book. Everything is better with better broadband. I repeat it here and throughout this book to shed a clear, bright light on a complex topic. This is not a technologically determinist argument. The mere existence of broadband in a rural community does not correct rural inequality ipso facto, although the lack of connectivity certainly does not help. Instead, I invoke this phrase to demonstrate how broadband, rural broadband, and broadband policy are lived and experienced or not on the ground in rural communities throughout the country. Broadband policy, such as it is, may be written in Washington with legal prose refined at the headquarters of AT&T, Verizon, CenturyLink, Windstream, and Frontier. But it is lived in Laverne, Minnesota, McKee, Kentucky, and Monroe, Virginia. At its furthest, Jocelyn's phrase parallels conversations occurring at the United Nations and the European Union about whether internet access can be called a human right, akin to the right for information, education, and participation. Closer to home, it reminds us that at the end of the day, broadband is not about policy, politics, technology, or money. It is about people. When deployed democratically and harnessed inclusively, everything can be better with better broadband. From homework to work, to voting, to health, to talking with Grant. Everything is better with better broadband is a call to end the rural-urban digital divide and the multitude of digital divides brought on by inequality in the United States. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Chris, for the wonderful presentation. We have a couple of questions on Zoom, but did anybody in the room want to kick us off first?
If anyone also has experiences of broadband that they want to share, please feel welcome to. I mean, I think this is also used as a collective therapy session to vent our frustrations with some of our broadband network performance and builds.
Okay, well, I've got a question from the Q&A on Zoom from Curtis Emerald. Sorry if I butchered your name, Curtis. He says, as everyone knows, rural is a poorly defined term covering a wide variety of communities. Your examples seem to be central areas of connectivity, which are reasonably well suited to fiber. Many places are served by WISPs, who make use of asymmetric wireless technologies to bring connectivity. Does your argument make any room for that? And then I would also add to that, how does your argument make room for that?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. Thank you so much for that. In the book, I do spend a lot of time talking about the benefits of fixed wireless networks, and they're particularly beneficial for agricultural communities, where fiber actually is not suited for them because you can't possibly connect up a combine, right? So fixed wireless is actually going to be the solution, I think, for modern agriculture. What concerns me about fixed wireless, and what I talk about in the book, is the potential for overpromising. And we certainly saw that with the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund, with companies like LTE. That said, WISPs, wireless internet service providers, are doing amazing work at connecting rural communities. And I think particularly when I work with counties, one of the advantages of WISPs is that you can offer a fiber optic backhaul to, for instance, a tower, and then still provide high performance, high speed broadband connectivity. That still is, still better than Starlink. It's better than DSL, and oftentimes does provide enough bandwidth for people's day-to-day life. I think the question becomes also technologically, what kind of backhaul we're using. Obviously, we want a fiber optic backhaul. Microwave backhaul has been seen to be somewhat limited for deploying speeds. But no, I definitely do not take the potential of WISP for rural America to task in the book, but rather I critique the hype, sometimes along with these technologies. So thank you. I don't know why I'm looking at the projection, but thank you. Thank you to Chris.
Well, we have a second question from Zoom that is sort of closer to my interest as well. So I'm gonna bring this one up. And it's from Scott Loveridge here at the College of Agriculture and Natural Resources. He says, much is better with broadband, but it can expose local businesses to outside competition. Maybe better for consumers, but it could be costly for mom and pop businesses. I know that you as a scholar in political economy probably think about these things as well. So do you want to speak on a little bit about how broadband introduction actually may introduce rural communities to externalities that might damage them?
Yeah, I mean, that is a great question with a lot of moving parts. I'm going to tackle them maybe one at a time. I'll take the last part of the question first, if you don't mind, and that is the idea of affordability. We pay too much for the internet. We pay way too much, and the part of that is because of lack of competition. So this is where a lot of the book comes about. How can we mobilize local companies, local providers to deploy better networks, which of course means we need to get them money. We need to get them funding. But I am a huge fan of the emergency broadband benefit package, which of course subsidizes broadband for consumers. Maybe one of the things that we need is such a program to subsidize broadband for businesses, particularly rural businesses, who I think know, I don't want to speak for them, certainly not, but at least many of them that I spoke with understand and want broadband. They want to actually be able to reach a different market or a larger market, or just, for instance, be able to use a credit card, which we can all take for granted, but which some places in rural America can't do because there's not enough capacity, not enough network capacity to do a credit card transaction. So it's not always about putting your stuff up on eBay or Etsy or Amazon. Sometimes it's just literally managing day-to-day work, payroll, credit cards, health insurance. All of this would be essential for a small rural business on top of the potential for the market. So I think the benefits outweigh the risks here, but there need to be policy apparatuses to make it easier for them, just like it is for consumers to subscribe. That's a great question.
Johannes.
Yeah, thanks, Chris, for a really wonderful and insightful presentation. Now, I sort of want to challenge you a little bit, right, and be the devil's advocate. And so I can read your story in a sense as federal policy has failed us for the past 20 years. And now we're repealing the federal policy to save us, right? And so there's a certain inconsistency in this. And so you say you're cautiously optimistic. You mentioned NTIA is distributing the funding. Well, NTIA distributed BTOP funding, and a lot of that was misspent 10 years later. And so I'm wondering, what is sort of the root causes? Why policy seems to be at the federal level, but also at the state level, so uncoordinated and fragmented, right? I mean, we don't have a good funding program for universal service to establish broadband. Part of it goes back to Congress's a strong desire not to tax the internet, right? I mean, it's a ridiculous funding model that is currently in place. So we throw in tax funding, and it seems we're making incremental progress. As much as I endorse all this progress, right? I think they're really good moves. It seems that a sustainable longer-term solution needs to look different, right? And I was wondering whether you could comment on how we could gradually get. I sort of like your emphasis of local players. And I think wonderful work is done locally by many, many initiatives. Unfortunately, I think currently their sustainability also depends on federal funding.
Right.
And it's not clear whether once that funding goes away, right, those initiatives will remain sustainable. Anyway, any comments?
No, that's great. Thank you so much. So I see 4 interconnected parts, right? History, USF, NTIA, and the future. So I'm going to maybe start with history, right? There has never been a time in which federal policy in telecommunications did not favor industry. That has never happened, right? Despite the fact that we might say like, oh, well, even Roosevelt, right? Like AT&T has always been in favor of the FCC until I guess we broke it. Right, so the reason I'm saying this is not to be glib, but just to say that, the system, as we're learning in so many different areas, is actually performing the way it should be, which is to make telecom money, right? So I think part of what would be ideal is a complete overhaul of telecommunication policy in this country. Unfortunately, there is zero appetite, at least in my research, to open or rewrite the 1996 Telecommunications Act, which itself was a compromise between AT&T and the Clinton administration. So I think there's a number of levers here, but at least what I'm seeing is a lack of appetite and a lack of political will to open up telecom policy. In the same way that there's a lack of will to re-engineer the Universal Service Fund. So for those of you who aren't familiar with this, the Universal Service Fund is administered by the FCC through an organization known as the Universal Service Administrative Company. And what it is that telecom companies, telephone companies in particular, pay a certain amount based on location and based on landline phone use. And this is all passed down to the consumer. So if you actually look at your bill, you'll see a USF line item, right? That money goes to the USF and is used to subsidize particularly broadband in high-cost areas. Now, who here has a landline phone? Someone has a landline phone? One of us, okay. 2 of us, okay. So 30 years ago, we would all return, right? Which means that the USF is going down from 30 people in this room, there's not 30, 20 people in this room to 2 people. That's less money. So what do? They raise the USF Right now it's 26%. 26% of your bill is added on as the USF tax. This is absolutely unsustainable because who does it get taxed to? Particularly low-income households, right? We need to revise the USF. And I actually wrote an op-ed in the Hill talking about different ways that we could think about revising the USF. One, of course, is the idea that do we, instead of just leveraging consumers to pay on their telephone bills, do we do an additional add-on on the internet bill? The other fact is that there's nothing saying that telecom companies have to pass the cost on to consumers. That's what they do. I would prefer if we could think about USF in a way that doesn't tax the consumer, whether or not that means a tax, for instance, on high-using providers. So some countries, for instance, have decided to tax Netflix for its existence, right? If you operate in this country, you have to pay a certain amount. France has done this, for instance. Normally, that's not done through a tax, but rather through Netflix have to contribute so much to French cultural domestic production. Canada has done the same. So we do, just as I think we need to reorient the entirety of our telecommunications policy apparatus, which would be ideal, we also need to really reconsider the way USF is done because it is no longer sustainable. Johannes, you also mentioned NTIA. I think BTOP and BIP, which was the USDA program. Well, I think BTOP was more successful than BIP, first of all. But you're absolutely right that some of the money was misappropriated, was misspent. I think part of it is not about the good intentions of NTIA. I think it's about good intentions. I think they're very poorly staffed. They literally do not have enough money. And this is something that is really concerned me with NTIA getting the money, which is, do they have enough people power to marshal $65 billion worth of funding? And that's something that is very concerning for me. So I haven't seen any earmarks to increase the staffing in NTIA. I will say that a number of telecom experts were approached to be program reviewers on a volunteer basis, which I found a little disturbing. I feel like staff should do that on volunteer labor. But yeah, is it better than FCC in that there's less political regulatory capture? Yes, but there is still, you're absolutely right to point out that there is still that concern. I think particularly the concern should be with around staffing. Oh wait, the future, okay. I have really wrestled with whether or not I should have recommended in my book, this is a little like real talk for a second, to try and publicize or nationalize the broadband network. I chose not to do that, not because I don't think it's important, not because I don't think it's an important conversation, but because I don't think it's realistic in a time in which we need to get Americans broadband. Not today, not tomorrow, but yesterday. So my policy is a series of policy interventions of what we can do tomorrow, right? Literally tomorrow, we can start having these conversations. There are a number of scholars that say, you know what we need to do is just nationalize the whole system, or at least where there isn't broadband. The federal government should just go in and deploy fiber. I think that's a really interesting possibility. I just don't think it's going to happen. I don't think there's an appetite for that type of public infrastructure. So my recommendations are geared towards an intervention on how we can nudge policy to be more democratic, nudge policy to be more efficient, nudge policy to privilege more of the local providers. But I take all of your pushes because I think they're all really important. And I hope some of them are addressed in the book. And I hope I addressed most of them. Those are really great points that we certainly need to keep talking about.
We have a couple questions in the Zoom, and Kate, since we've already done a couple Zoom questions, let's do one more room question, and then we'll go back to Zoom.
Great. Hey, Chris. Love the presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you. So I have a few questions, but one of the more pressing ones is that there seems to be a general assumption that you have already convinced the world that the internet is a good thing in rural areas. That rural areas will just kind of open up and say, yes, please come dig up the ground, put in these fibers. Mm-hmm. And so part of my concern is I don't see a logistical solution to, for example, I think about Gene, right? So Gene, there's a fiber line within sight of his farm.
Yeah.
You look across the field, but you know there's a fiber line there. But to get it to his house, we would have to dig a trench, to that line across 2 other farms.
Yeah.
Or you could, maybe follow the road all the way around kind of a weird windy way. And so I'm not convinced that you can convince the farmers to let you dig up their ground to put in the fiber.
Mm-hmm.
And then access to that fiber, how is that controlled?
Right.
And then the farmer who's between Gene and that fiber line has never used this technology, has heard terrible things about it. It's poisoning kids' minds, it's maybe creating ADHD, kids who use it do poor in school. It seems like just a bad thing for me and my family.
Right.
So how do you overcome just those basic logistical concerns?
And that's a great question. Thank you. So 2 parts is like the technological, the actual getting it there, and then the question is one of the options, right? This is where I actually think in these situations it's not a fiber-based. It shouldn't be a fiber-based solution. This is where fixed wireless can be really important. Setting up a series of towers that can tap into that fiber optic backhaul, for instance, would be tremendously useful for both the farmers and maybe for Gene as well. This is why I do not like the idea of I support an idea of technological neutrality. It should not just be fiber, because fiber isn't going to work for every community. It's also going to be too expensive for a lot of communities. So a fiber exclusive framework, I don't think will work. So a fixed wireless system, I think is definitely possible. As to those who are, maybe there isn't the appetite there for broadband adoption, this is where I think we've done a very poor job in doing active translation. And I've spent a lot of time, particularly now recently, working with counties in Virginia. And one of the aspects of just knowledge that is missing is what exactly broadband is. Like everyone's hearing this word broadband, we don't know what it is. Federal Communication Commission certainly doesn't make it easier to understand their policy decisions, right? We don't have these moments of translation. And so this is where, again, particularly for agricultural communities, I think USDA has a tremendous potential here, because what is trusted may not be that the infrastructure of the internet is not trusted, but what is trusted is the USDA extension service. There's a tremendous amount of trust, legacies of trust built into these buildings. They have now been they're incredibly understaffed now. But if we could imagine a situation in which they were empowered and educated, I'm talking about the USDA staff now, to then perform moments of education, perform moments of conversation, I think that can be tremendously powerful. And there is precedent. This is exactly what happened in 1939 with something called the REA circuits, where REA, which recently was then folded into the USDA, sent community folks, sent their extension officers out to talk to people about electricity and the value of electricity. So it wasn't, a Washington, D.C. person, it wasn't a telecom executive, it wasn't a scholar. Well, it could have been a scholar, it wasn't, someone parachuting in, but it was someone local who was trusted. And I'd love to see a model like that. Because I think, again, that accountability, that face-to-face interaction can go a long way in dispelling some of these concerns.
Okay, so one last question because we're running out of time. This one is from Phoebe Sengers at Cornell University, who will actually be our speaker in October. She says, your work understandably focuses on improving broadband access. One question I have is, why is everything better with better broadband? My sense, derived from Jennifer Reynolds' work as well as your own, is that everything becomes better not because broadband in and of itself is good, but because we have built a world in which broadband access is necessary in order to access services, education, the economy, etc. Do you believe there is value in thinking about how such infrastructure could be built to be less broadband demanding, or is that tilting against windmills?
That's a really good question. Certainly we can talk about broadband in a much larger social totality that thinks about replace broadband with just infrastructure, right? Everything can be better with better infrastructure. Our roads can be better, our sewage can be better, our water can be better, right? Our broadband can be better. So when I marshal statements like this, it is not. I don't see this as a zero-sum game, where if I write a book on broadband infrastructure, it does not take away from the other components of either the digital divide or of infrastructure. Instead, I think that we can draw attention to we need better broadband for Americans. But absolutely, PB is right that wires in the ground, wires in the air, Starlink up in the sky is not in and of itself going to do anything. What we need to do is do infrastructure plus everything else, right? And that's the complicated part. That's the moving target part. And that's actually another, if I wrote another book, it would not be about infrastructure. It'd be about that everything else, that inclusion aspect, that equity aspect, that educational aspect, right? We're still missing all of this. And if you look at how much money is going to digital inclusion, it's not nearly as much as we might need, right? So I actually, yes, I agree with Phoebe, but I don't see it as one is being done at the expense of the other. I think that they all need to happen. But we need to get water to the ground.
Gene, we can answer the other questions. Yeah, you can also.
Oh, yeah.
Yes. So I'll just note that I'll be taking down the questions that are remaining, and I'll forward them on to Chris. But
my email and Twitter feeds are right here. So please get in touch. Thank you to everyone who's here. Thank you for this invitation. Thank you for the conversation. Thank you to everyone in Zoom land for tuning in. This is my hound dog Tuna, the best research assistant known to an assistant professor at the time. So thank you again very much for joining me for this conversation.